I'm really appreciate the opportunity of coming down and speaking, particularly to an audience that I don't get to talk to very much. I think there's a lot of relevance to the kind of work that our institute does, to your work, the business of planning at sub-provincial scales, and I want to walk through a little bit of that here today. So I'd like to start with a few quotes, and fundamentally I think the reason that my institute exists and the reason that a lot of us do work is around this issue of sustainability. We'll hear the three pillars, we hear about economy, we hear about social sustainability, and we also hear about environmental sustainability. And one of the things that I think, at least in cities, we're becoming further detached from, I don't believe that's as true in the rural communities, is the notion that the environment isn't something that is on par. You don't have sustainable economies and you don't have sustainable societies if your environment is not a sustainable one. And that's one of the lenses that I like to look at the work that we do as an institute through. And this notion that we are managing for a purpose, not just today, but to keep the options open for people who are going to be coming after us, so in the future. I'll point out that, no, I'm not a grandparent yet, but I do hope to be one. So my purpose here today is to certainly raise awareness about what the ABMI is and what we do, to discuss some of the challenges that our province, so where we're going as a province in terms of monitoring. Certainly the notion of integration is a big one. Across this entire province, there are a number of conversations that are happening, and I think they will affect how we receive and get our information around monitoring. The notion of integrating across space, so we're measuring the same things in the same way throughout the province. Between scales, so if we're talking about the provincial scale, the health of biodiversity or water at a provincial scale, how does that translate back down to the local scale, a quarter section of land? And then finally, between data, so making sure that the data it can build the story of sustainability upon one another in an efficient way, and the scientists get all fussed up when that doesn't start happening. A world of easy accessibility for the information, where costs are rationalized and reasonable and the information can be made available quickly to make smart choices. Home run for me, if nothing else, the top two are great. Home run for me is to develop a relationship where our institute can start working with one WPAC, even in a cursory way, and start developing some of the tools and applying some of the science to the business, your business needs. So the quick outline, I just wanted to talk about a bit about our institute, some communication issues, application of knowledge, so how do you use the science to support policy and planning, and then open it up for questions. Biodiversity, I view it as a catch-all phrase. Sometimes it is a nuisance. It's sort of a vague concept that everybody has an idea of what it means, and it means different things to different people. At the end of the day, I think that all of the words on this slide, they all come back to the issue of sustainability. Sometimes we like to put barriers between them, but really if you're talking about cumulative effects, you're talking about wildlife, if you're talking about healthy aquatic ecosystems, we're all talking generally about the same thing. That's the life in this province, and we want to be responsible stewards of that environment for today and for future generations. As an organization, we're registered as a not-for-profit society under the Alberta Societies Act. We're member-based, we're board-led. The board is very diverse. So it's currently chaired by Greg Taylor, the former Dean of Science. Ernie Huey, who you heard from earlier, he's on our board representing the Government of Alberta. Simon Dyer, some of you might know, with the Pembina Institute, sits on our board of directors, as does David Price. So he's with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, Vice President of Western Operations. A couple of things before we get into what we do. I want to make it very clear at the front what we as an organization do not do. We don't make management decisions and we don't recommend management decisions. That's not our business. There's management agencies and organizations that do that. We're in the business of providing policy and science advice and information. We don't advocate. So we won't advocate that one more development should or should not go ahead, that urbanization around the city of Edmonton and annexation should or should not go ahead. That's not our job to advocate for or against development or protected areas. We are very much a service provider, and we're not an academic service provider. So we deal in science, but our clients are stakeholders and decision makers. The goal of our institute is a simple one: to be able to track the changes in biodiversity across this province at a provincial and sub-provincial scale, and then talk about why that change is happening. To do that, the basic survey grid for us, 1,656 locations. Every 20 kilometers across the province, we have a new installation, a new monitoring installation. They're randomly located, meaning that they are on every kind of land base. They're in Department of National Defense, they're in the national parks, private land, public land. There's a few in downtown Edmonton and Calgary. Red deer, they land where they land, so we are monitoring all of Alberta. They could be in a ditch, they could be in a wheat field. They really truly represent the province of Alberta. Every one of those sites has a land site that we randomly go to, and then it has an associated wetland. So there's 1,656 land sites and 1,656 wetlands that we're monitoring across the province. At full operations, we're not there yet. Fully funded full operations will be getting back to each one of these sites every 5 years. Our institute was designed to monitor biodiversity in perpetuity. So as long as there's a need for this kind of information, we're in the business of doing it. So at full operations, about 340 of these sites annually, get through 340. After 5 years, cycle right back and start again and do it over. What we measure, we spend most of our time looking at species diversity. Several thousand species are collected by our organization or captured information on them. We look at landscape diversity, habitat diversity, so the things that we can manage, a little more physically manage, in order to talk about how species are changing and why that's happening. And then finally, backing right up, the #1 driver on our landscapes, human development, land use. So the kind of policies and planning that happen, how that drives the habitat, and subsequently how that drives species. So that's the scope of our business in terms of monitoring. When it comes to species, we didn't pick 5, 10, or 13 indicator species and say, these are the indicator species, talk about the health of biodiversity in perpetuity in Alberta. We had a different lens when we started thinking on this, to be around and relevant in perpetuity. The species that you pick today may well not be here 10, 15, 20, 30 years out. It just might not be. The reasons are varied. It could be things big like climate change and the conditions locally are just not reasonable for that species, or it could be that it's extirpated or it's extinct. That stuff happens over the longer time horizons, especially in busy parts of the world. So we have an emphasis on species assemblages. As a result, we really capture data on about 4,000 to 5,000 species, and we have good data on about half of those. So we can talk about trends, and I don't think I'll mention it again as I go through here, but fundamentally we are a trend monitoring organization. That's what we're built to do. We still have a number of years, maybe 2 or 3, before we can start talking about trends in some of the regions of the province. But being able to have relevant data on plants, mosses, lichens, the birds, mammals, as we march through time. In terms of habitat, I'll just flash these up. In terms of habitat, we measure habitat in a number of ways. In the field, so coring trees, looking at the grass structure, looking at wetland structure and the amount of human activity or cattle activity around the wetlands. We're also monitor using remote sensing, monitor at 2 spatial scales. One, a provincial scale, so there's a provincial land cover that we manage, and we're now going through the process of trying to update that. And then anybody who's familiar with Alberta Vegetation Inventory or with Grassland Vegetation Inventory, we do a version of that, so detailed photo mapping at each one of our sites for 3 by 7 kilometers, and we'll update those on a 5-year cycle as well to talk about regional trends in very detailed habitat. The human footprint, human land use, human disturbance, whatever your language is around that. We manage 2 products. One is a provincial wall-to-wall product on human footprint. I'll talk about that a little later. And then a sample-based status and trends. Again, the AVI-GVI variant, Grassland Vegetation or Alberta Vegetation Inventory variant, where we look at changes in human activity, land use across the province on a sample basis. I don't know if it's true in your world, but it is in mine. Dealing particularly with government, there's a big, I don't know why this exists, but it does. There's often discussion around what human footprint means. So I try to be very clear up front. When the ABMI talks about human footprint and trends in human footprint, land use, what we're talking about is what you can see out of the side of a plane at 200 feet above ground, 300 feet above ground. So if you're flying over it, you can see that we've run a plow through it, we've broken the sod. If you can see that we put a well site or a new house, a road, pipelines, you can see that stuff. That's human footprint in our world, and that's what I'll be reporting on primarily. You can dress that stuff up afterwards, but this is fundamentally what we talk about. Just, I guess this is the infomercial part of it. So freely available right now on our website. Some of you I know have access to it already, and just so everyone knows, there's two products, Human Footprint in Alberta circa 2007 and Human Footprint in Alberta circa 2010. These are the best data, or provincial, best data sources on the status of human land use across the entire province. So they start with the GOA base layers, and then we've built out, taken a couple of years to build them out. So they're publicly available, and they're freely available to anybody who's really keen to download GIS data. And we're just starting to work on the 2012 update, and then ideally we'll be updating that annually thereafter. And that's what it looks like. So if you were to download it, it's just a polygon shape file for GIS folks. That in this picture, that's Innisfree. I'm not picking on Innisfree. Most of central Alberta looks like that. So the gold is agricultural fields, the blue are residents, usually smaller residents, the blue circles, and then you can see in there the green squares, that's oil and gas activity. And the white stuff on that image is area that we have not developed, so it's native in and around the rivers and stream banks, primarily. But that coverage exists for the entire province. So schematically, the layout, I guess back to the ABMI, 1,656 sites. We did a bunch of remote sensing at each one of these sites, in some cases provincially, and then we put out boots in the field at the nearest wetland and at the land site and visit that to look at the status of biodiversity. This gives you a sense of where we've been to date. The blue dots in that image are ones that we've already visited, and the data is either online and freely available now, or it will soon be coming. And the red dots are what we're planning to do this year. So we've hired field crews, and we're getting ready to head back out into the field to do some work primarily in the northeast, in the oil sands area, and in the far south. So those have been, well, lean times in terms of funding. So we've been really focusing our effort on doing a good job from essentially Calgary south, the southern part of the province, grasslands, and then in the oil sands area. In addition to that, there's a whole bunch of work that happens on leveraged monitoring. So using the same protocols to address a very specific management challenge, it makes it very easy to integrate data between data sets and talk about one continuous story. And that's been happening increasingly with government or academic researchers. On the communication side, I'd like to talk about, so if you dialed our program back to when we were first conceived, everyone thought we were going to collect raw data, and that was going to be it. So we're just going to collect it in a standardized way, give it away for free, and everyone would be happy. And it turns out no one was happy. So without adding value to that raw data, the folks who took over management of the program were very confident that the funding would not be there. We were just not going to be relevant. So we spent a bunch of time working on the math behind status and trends assessments, probably more relevant associations. So if there is a change in biodiversity, what's its relationship to land use? And then finally, we realized this one the hard way, a lot of work now to try and outreach, to get to management tables, decision-making tables, and help apply the data. So that's the scope of our business in terms of, functionally in terms of using the data and making it available. When we talk about biodiversity, there's no easy way to talk about it. Nobody's got this challenge licked in the world. I often see images where there's 27 green arrows going up and a bunch yellow arrows going right or left, and then red arrows going down. And making sense of the issue of sustainability and biodiversity is not something that we've done well. We're taking a crack at it, and I think we still have a lot to learn. The way we address this is we look at individual species, primary data at the bottom of this pyramid. So we know where we saw it in the province of Alberta. When we did see it, we know how many there were. Were there 1, 2, were there 27? So we have an idea of occurrence, and we have an idea of abundance. That gives us a snapshot or a picture, a window into the status of that species in the province. If you start to then aggregate that data, so in this case the meadowlark is one of 15 species that migrates down to the US for the winter and then it's back, we can start to group these species into intelligent ways that make sense to people's business and talk about the status of short distance migrants. Maybe we're interested in the status of all grassland birds, regardless of where they migrate in the winter, or all birds. It's not just grassland birds, but we're keen on all of them within a region. And then finally aggregating up further, biodiversity. Combining the information we have about birds with plants, moss, lichens, bugs in the soil, mammals, and then talk about one metric for the province or one metric for a region within the province, and scaling between depending on the application. We have an index that we use internally and increasingly externally. It's called an intactness index. In its conception, it's fairly straightforward. It goes from 100% or high intactness to 0% low intactness. It used to be, we called it 100% was high naturalness or high integrity, and 0% was low. It turns out both of those terms have a lot of baggage, and I was putting fires out. So we have this generic intactness idea, but the concept behind it remains exactly the same. In pictures, it looks like that. 100% intact means that you're probably maintaining most, if not all, of the suite of species in a landscape or a wetland ecosystem. And as you move towards zero, you're taking on risk. So the risk is increasing. You're much more likely to be dealing with species at risk, cleaning up the water, cleaning up the air, and having acute management challenges associated with that. So the theme for many of the slides that follow here, this 100 to 0%, I just wanted to spend a bit of time working that out. I'm not going to dwell on the math, although I get questioned on it almost every time, so I'm going to show a couple of slides. So for the many thousands of species, not many thousands, that's no, many hundreds of species that we deal with, each one of them has models, statistical models that are fairly complex running behind them. Foxtail barley, this is an image of foxtail barley. This is the real data from Alberta's grasslands and how this species responds to human activity. In this case, I've taken out well sites and urbanization. Agriculture is the primary driver for this species, so I've just shown it simply that way. And it increases about twofold. So as you go from native pasture, untouched native pasture, or relatively untouched native pasture, to areas where agriculture pretty well dominates the landscape, this species about doubles. When I talk about the science, that's my reference condition. So it's today, and it's an imaginary reference condition where we say, what happens if we removed all the human footprint on the landscape? We can then compare that to any region. So observed versus, I mean, if anybody's keen on this stuff, it's observed minus expected. We expected to find 1, we went out and we saw 2. And our metrics and intactness only deal with the absolute difference between observed minus expected. So we're interested in how far every species deviates from its reference condition. How big a difference is there between them? And we can do that for every species. So they don't all respond the same to land use. Needle and threadgrass there's a much different story there. This species doesn't like agricultural activity in the same way that foxtail does. So by about 50% land use, agricultural land use, in an area, this species is a little more than half gone. So you can expect that that will happen. And it's the same thing, expected conditions, what you observe in your region of interest, whether it's a municipality of Lethbridge or whether it's one of the WPAC regions. And then the absolute difference between them. So in terms of what we have to offer, raw data, the data is freely available. We have no proprietary interest in the data. There is a barrier. I mean, it's easy to say that data is free and available. That's not always true. It is free, it is available, but you have to have somebody in your shop or be handy with a computer and statistics to be able to use it. So you have to understand and invest some time in using it and being able to make it accessible. So it's often a false advertisement. In addition, we do application support, and we do a whole bunch around core reporting, which I'm not going to touch a whole lot on here today. The broader applications, the system wasn't built for one application or one use. It was built to be able to support many, many things. Regional planning is absolutely where we as an organization need to be. If we don't support regional planning and do it well, then fundamentally we've got some issues within our institute. I mean, that's what this thing was built to do, whether it's provincial or sub-regional. Cumulative effects assessment, as that comes online. Site level monitoring and reporting for sure, particularly around issues of reclamation. This is sort of a newer area. Climate change adaptation, we're exploring that, and I'll speak a bit about that. And then finally, ecological services and what that starts to look like. So from a planning point of view, I often start here. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the land use framework and the land use secretariat's work. So the 7 regional plans underpinned by legislation. There is a biodiversity management framework that is being developed. It's not there yet, but it is currently being developed and being piloted, I would characterize it as, for parts of the Lower Athabasca planning region. I expect that it will then move through and start to be applied to some of the other regions, South Saskatchewan second. So we are involved in at least supporting that. We don't do the management. We don't set targets and thresholds. That's not our business. But we help folks get that work done. Scenario modeling, it could involve setting targets. Most importantly, if you set a target, measure progress towards the target. So I often think of invasive weeds. We spend a fair bit of dollars, at least at a municipal level in this province, on tracking and trying to eradicate non-native weeds, whether they're in wetland ecosystems or upland ecosystems. I can't find any information on how well we're doing, which management practices, best management practices, which types of policies at municipal level are actually the most effective in giving you value for dollar. So set the target and then measure progress towards the target. Identifying the drivers of the change so that we learn from what we've applied, and then report on it publicly and in an unfettered way. So the reason that our institute was set up as a not-for-profit arm's length was to make sure that there was no ability to have political interference into the reporting process, that everyone trusted the data equally and we could make a decision based on the data and the best science and move forward with that and not point fingers at other people's data sources and crack open an argument. And then finally, increase bioliteracy. So make sure that people understand what this stuff is we're trying to manage and what sustainability issues look like. So I've just got a couple of examples here I want to run through on the planning side. Some work that we've recently done for the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, and more particularly the subregions in the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan. So the Government of Alberta has recognized 5 subregions within the Lower Athabasca. The Lower Athabasca Regional Plan itself represents 14% of the province, nearly 10% of the world's proven oil reserves, and of course we need, not just locally, but internationally, to be able to demonstrate that we're doing a good job in terms of management of that landscape. So I'm just going to flash through, I'm just touching on a few highlights as we go through. So in terms of human land use, human footprint, overall for that region, we're sitting at 7.3% today, as of 2010. Of that land has been directly altered by agriculture or by energy urbanization. That's up about 0.5% from 2007. So we've seen half a percent growth over a 3-year time period on that landscape. And the breakdown on a sub-regional basis are just as you would expect. In the north, not much, and in the far south, where agriculture exists, and many more people live around Cold Lake, the values of human land use are higher, proportionally higher. From a biodiversity point of view, we're increasingly starting to use images and data like this. So in this image, I'll orientate you here a little bit. You can see the legend. Where's the legend at? So you can see the legend kind of in the center top. Dark green represents about 91 to 100% biodiversity intactness for species. And zero, the dark red is 0 to 10% intactness. So the lowest for the 0 to 10% biodiversity intactness, and the highest for the dark green. And you can see that mines, I mean, as you'd expect, I guess, the mines have somewhere in the neighborhood of 0 to 10%, the lowest biodiversity intactness on that landscape. What we've done here is just averaged. This will be an average of about 500 and some species. So these maps exist for every single species, but if you take them all in aggregate, this is where we're at today. So 92% overall intact for that land use planning region, and then by sub-regions there's a breakdown. Yeah, I don't think I have anything else on that one. I'm not going to go through all of the data or data groups, but just to show you that there is some variance. 93% overall for mammals, so we've looked at 13 mammals, and these are the winter active ones, the moose, the marten, the wolves, and had a look at where they are at in that land use planning region, and on average 93%. And then again, you can break that down by sub-region. Integrated intactness index for the native plants. These are just native plants to the boreal forest or the northern parts of the parkland. We looked at 273 species here, 92%. And then we pulled out, this one's a bit trickier, but we pulled out data for the non-native plants. So these are primarily, they're about a 50-50 mix. So they're commercial species that exist on the landscape, or in many cases, things like dandelion and Canadian thistle, crested wheatgrass that are not native to North America. And overall 91% intact, and you can see the variance. Primarily associated with agricultural activities in the south, but then increasingly we expect they're going to be following energy development as that moves north. So fast facts, I just wanted to sort of move us away from the northeast, and some examples there to the Red Deer River watershed. I think you guys are a little more interested in this. The Red Deer River represents 7.5% of the province. Right now, 2.9% of the Red Deer River watershed is managed as a protected area, so provincial or federal park. We have 125 monitoring sites in that region, and to date we've surveyed 30% of them. We've detected about 1,000 species, and we have reasonable data again on about half of them. So if you see something once or twice, it doesn't add up to much statistically. This gives you a sense then within the Red Deer River where we've monitored. The red ones are finished, and the blue ones are areas that we're heading out to here in about a month and a half, 2 months' time. So these are draft findings. The science behind this isn't quite where we want it to be, but it's getting close. So plus or minus, this is using the same metrics what the Red Deer River watershed would look like. You can see, I mean, this is on the back of 100 years of pretty aggressive agricultural development policy, so there's no surprises here, at least there's not for me. And if we talk about, we can talk about the status of human footprint again in the Red Deer River watershed. Right now we have the data extracted for 2007 and 2009 from 55.8% to 56.4%, so about the same rate of development. So we continue to develop in the Red Deer River watershed, primarily agricultural and energy-related infrastructure. At any point, you can break that apart. You can actually look at the details. So as of 2010, agriculture sits at 48% of the land use, energy infrastructure at nearly 3%, industrial residential at 2%, and then transportation infrastructure at about 2.5%. And the transportation infrastructure is pretty consistent throughout most of the province. And then you can back up at any point and have a look at what's going on in each one of the WPAC regions. So on the left of each one of the numbers, you can see the 56% again for the Red Deer River, and then over a 3-year period it talks about change. So what is it, plus or minus? Are we adding new footprint, or are we erasing new footprint from those landscapes? So you can get a sense of what the rate of change is in current times. The only one, yeah, I mean, it's the far south that seems to be fairly stable in terms of not adding new. None of them are in the minuses. I don't think we're quite there in terms of our mentality, policies around reclamation, although we're hope to slow things down in the north, is my understanding. So you can back this stuff out to a provincial scale and talk about the province of Alberta in terms of intactness. I've just summarized two numbers here, 42% today and 55% in the grasslands. Again, very macro and aggregate. Or if you're very interested in this kind of stuff in terms of how you can apply this information, in this case, I, without any thought, just decided to put a 5-kilometer buffer on the Red Deer River and then have a snapshot there. So we can talk about within 5 kilometers, what are the quarter sections of land within 5 kilometers of the Red Deer River? If that's a meaningful metric or a meaningful piece of information to a planning process, what does that look like, where we're at today, and then what's the variance along that region? So those are, I think the iterations in the use of this kind of information are deep and diverse. I don't want to lose sight that that this is all available for individual species. There's more work that has to be done. It's a challenge on an individual species basis. But what you're looking at here right now is data for one species, the olive-sided flycatcher. It's a nationally listed species under the Species at Risk Act. And we pulled together a fair bit of data. Our data right now says that on average the species in the north is 91% healthy or intact. And we're working with a few other organizations to do it. But what you see here is that this species has a different response to different kinds of land use. So forestry does not have the same impact on this species as urbanization or as agriculture. You can convert all of that then into maps of where this species is, where it likes to be. In this case, the red is a decrease, so we expect that there's fewer of them than the reference condition, and a blue is an increase. So there's more of them than the reference condition. So I'll just talk about one more example. So there's a few projects that are sort of, if the ABMI thing that we just went through is the main body of the work, then there's plugins. So now how do we start to apply that to more specific applications? One of the applications is we've got a 3-year grant with CCEMC, the Climate Change and Emissions Management Corporation. Under this piece of work, we're interested in helping communities adapt, developing the tools to help communities and regions, so think municipalities or bigger, adapt to a changing climate. So the challenge here then is how to manage biodiversity in the face of a changing climate. And you can see two maps here that just talk about how we expect climate will change. So in the far south, some of the climates in the far south are going to be up in and around Red Deer and Edmonton probably in the next 40 to 50 years. And in the face of understanding that, what should we be thinking about in terms of our communities to help manage the ecosystems? So I'm just going to, 2 slides here that deal with understanding the challenge and applying the knowledge, some of the work that we're doing. In this case, there's this little orchid, so you can do this for species again. But on your left, there's a little orchid, and 2 maps here. The one on the left is present day, and the red is a hot spot, meaning that's good for this species. This species loves red, that red habitat, that's its preferred habitat today. And then as you move towards blue, it doesn't like it there. That's got nothing to do with land use, it's got everything to do with rainfall and climate. And then prediction based on the climate change information, the normals for climate change, what we expect to be happening as we move out to 2015, the range restriction or the area where this species finds preferred is very likely to move north and into higher elevations in the mountains. That's one of the things, so for individual species, trying to get a better understanding of how their habitat is going to be affected by climate change, and what are some of the things that we can do to help support that or facilitate that if we need to do anything at all. On the right-hand side, we're also looking at the distribution of ecosystems, so trying to build up some of the science behind what is expected to happen with this grassland ecosystem and then parkland ecosystems. In all cases, marching north over the years. So what you're seeing is yellow on the bottom is today, the climate norms for grassland ecosystems from 1961 to 1990, and then projections or predictions. I think reasonable predictions about what we can expect in terms of climate as that moves, as we move into the future. So I'm going to just jump right into the community adaptation and action planning stuff. So we're working with Mistakis Institute. They're brought in as a partner. out of Calgary, and they are much more interested in the social side of this. So how do we take the good science and then help apply it to regional basis? So we deal, again, our currency is the science and the data, but then it has implications for communities. So the so what factor, and then finally working to develop action plans. So identifying the possibilities of who we can be working with to start thinking about the planning on this, ongoing and working with people's ongoing and potential new actions and their points of insertion for the data. I think what we're learning as we go through this is most communities are doing most of this stuff already. Maybe not in a formalized way, but planning departments in municipalities are largely trying to deal with these challenges up front, and they've got a lot of the work underway, and it might not be in a formal basis. Yeah, and I'll end on this slide. So as I pointed out at the beginning, I think we are very much, as an institute, interested in working with folks on the water side, the WPAC planning side, exploring efficiencies and possibilities to apply the data. And particularly, our business is trying to understand how to apply this science to your business. So we do think that there are enormous efficiencies, particularly as a provincial monitoring system. As you heard from Ernie, provincial monitoring system becomes a reality in this province. I think the relationship between these science-based organizations and the managers, the people doing the work, needs to improve, and we need to find out how to make that data and information flow in an effective way.